The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Find a Faculty Job Part 2 Interview and Negotiation, sponsored by ORS New Investigator Mentoring Committee. My name is Lucas Liu, a faculty at the University of Delaware and a member of the New Investigator Committee. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. The first part of this webinar was about how to prepare a job application package and get interviews. We have received great feedbacks about part 1. If you didn't attend the first part, you can find the video easily on ORS website by Google ORS Webinar. Please be aware that this webinar is also being recorded and will be posted on the web. All webinar participants will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into question box in the menu located on the right side of your screen. We will address all the questions at the end of the presentation. So today we have two wonderful speakers, Professor Mitch Schaffler and Professor Eve Donnelly. Our first speaker will be Dr. Schaffler from the City College of New York. Dr. Schaffler is the CUNY and Wallace Coulter Distinguished Professor and the Chair of Department of Biomedical Engineering at the City College of New York. He is a world-renowned authority on bone fatigue and macro damage, remodeling and fragility processes. He joined the City College in 2008 from the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, where he had been professor of orthopedics, functional morphology, and anatomy, and the director of orthopedic research since 1998. Dr. Schaffler has mentored over 3,000 PhD students and more than 20 postdocs. Many of his mentees have been very successful in academia, and several are now themselves department chairs or institute leaders. As a director of the Orthopedic Research Lab and the chair of BME department, Dr. Schaffler has interviewed and recruited many candidates for faculty positions. Today, he will share his insight on interview and negotiation. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Schaffler.
Thank you, Lucas, and welcome to all of you who are on this conference. I hope everyone can hear me. So I'm going to start today with a discussion of how to interview and negotiate for that first faculty position, or actually in subsequent faculty positions as well. And as Lucas indicated, I've had some experience in this area. So first thing is I would like to get the slides to work. So, okay, hang on for a second. Okay, so the first thing is you get invited for an on-site interview, all right? And how does this happen? Well, it used to happen by invitation letter, but these days it's more likely to happen by a combination of email and often a phone call from the chair of the search committee or a chair of the department. All right. One of the first things to do is I hope you're all getting multiple invitations to interviews, okay, but please, when you schedule your interviews, separate your interviews because the process of interviewing is grueling and it will be exhausting. You do not want to schedule back-to-back interviews. You want to be your very best for each time you visit an institution. So separate your interviews. It's a practical tool that I want to share with everybody, right? And you must be prepared, and what do you need to do, and what should you expect when you go for your interview? Well, that's what I want to talk to you about for the next few minutes. So one of the first things I want to put out there is the idea that it is an interview is a misnomer. It's many, many interviews during the course of the time you're going to be visiting a program, and it's many individual interviews and often a group interview or something of that nature as well. So you should really call it the interviews, not the interview. Okay. And some of the key features, besides talking to individual faculty and administrators, are going to be how you present your science and how you present what you're going to offer to the department. And those are included in how you present your seminar and what is also often called the chalk talk. And I'm going to flesh these out for you. But I want to start by saying that for the seminar, your research seminar, many hiring decisions or not to hire decisions are made based on this. I mean, the importance of this can't be overstated. And as I said, we'll talk about the so-called chalk talk, which is becoming more common as well as a second component. So what does a program expect when you give your research seminar? The people in the audience, and remember, the audience are not specialists in your area. They're not in your particular microcosm of science. So they're going to be people from in a BME department or in a cell biology department who represent the entire spectrum of science that's done in that program. So they want to know, is your research a good fit for what they do, and does it fit one of their concentrations or an interest that they want to move into? They're going to assess the research quality. Is this good work? This is also when they're going to see whether you're a good teacher or not. This is where you take a complex, difficult subject of scientific arcane information and present it to a diverse audience. And this is something to keep in mind. If you're presenting your own brand of science and you happen to be a molecular biologist and you happen to love gel shift assays, and you're talking to a group of clinicians and engineers and they don't understand what these things mean, you've lost your audience. So you have to be a good teacher and you have to figure out how to convey complex information for the common denominator that is your audience. And at the end of any seminar, as you know, there's a question and answer period. And this gives them a good sense of your personality and how you handle tough questions and, and how you handle stress. So these are all evident and interrogated during the seminar process. As I've intimated already, you have to know your audience, all right? All likelihood is you're not going to be talking to 2 or 3 people, only 2 or 3 people who are specialists in your little area. So you have to be the generalist in teaching them the core principles and make sure you get the teaching points across. The science and the details are complementary. It's the key point that you want to get across. So how much research you include in your slides? Well, you include as much as you want to include and as much as you want to show off. But if you have a very technical talk, and it's going to be, and the technique is only understood by 3 people in the audience, and you have 30 people in the audience, you better prepare yourself to give the general lesson as well, because that's key to how they're going to evaluate your effectiveness as a communicator. And again, the same. If you could talk about one impressive project that you did that advanced the field, or you can talk about many smaller projects that amount to a body of literature. There's no single strategy on that. It's about communicating who you are and what you've done and getting the audience excited about your science. Okay? And again, practice, practice, practice. Every mentor you've ever had has said this, but when you practice, don't practice just to your laboratory research group that already knows what you're doing. Invite your friends, postdocs, graduate students from other labs and make sure that the people who are outside of your area understand what you're trying to communicate. So what is the so-called chalk talk? Well, those of us who are older and have gray hair, and as you saw from my photograph, I fit that category, remember when classrooms had blackboards and used chalk, though most now have whiteboards and use a marker. But there are different formats for this, and the general idea is that you're going to stand up there in front of a blackboard or a whiteboard with a writing implement of some sort. Sometimes you're allowed to use a few PowerPoint slides, and sometimes this is done as an informal group meeting where it's done with no visual props. You have to explain it verbally. And it's often a research-focused talk that really emphasizes your future plans. In other words, once you come to the program, to the department, what are you going to do? How are you going to set up your lab? What are your first grant proposals going to look like? What are your priorities? Are you going for foundation grants early on? What is your strategy going to look like? So this is where you lay out, if you will, your operational plan for the first couple of years. And in that, you're going to talk a little bit about specific aims and things that I'll outline in a moment. And usually at the end of that, they're going to ask you to also address some words to to what you can teach within their departmental mission. There are a couple of institutions that I've run across who actually ask the visiting candidate to deliver a lecture in a didactic area of interest in biomedical engineering or molecular biology. So there are some places that will ask you to do a practice lecture as well. And this is meant to all give the committee and the department a good sense of how you're going to present yourself interactively, how you think on your feet when people are interrupting you, and how well thought out your plan is. And this is actually oftentimes tougher than the seminar itself. So for research, if it's the research part of your so-called chalk talk, you should talk about what is your future research area, what is it that you're going to concentrate on. Your likelihood you're not going to continue on what you did in your postdoc directly because that's probably related to somebody else's research. And you should be able, in general terms, to talk about the specific aims, the plan, the strategy, and sort of the approach you're going to use. This isn't meant to get feedback on your specific aims and troubleshoot your aims, but you should be well thought out enough about what it is you're planning to do that you have some general aims or questions that you're going to try and address. And as I mentioned before, you should say something about which grants you plan to submit and when in the course of your first 3 to 5 years. I think Eve is going to address that in more detail. You should specifically address which funding agencies and what sources are going to be targeted. If you're going to start up with foundation grants, talk about which foundations are interested in your research. And if you think that your initial plan is going to be targeted towards an R03 or an NSF grant or a small R01, you should make that very specific for people in the audience. It will show that you've thought about how you're going to conduct yourself and use your resources when you get there, and it'll give them a better sense that you understand the lay of the land. You should also say, what's your advantage and edge on these projects? First of all, you're going to have to separate yourself from what you did with your previous mentors. If you're doing something that's totally derivative of what your previous mentors have done, that's not good. That's not all that competitive or effective. On the other hand, if you peeled off something that's part of a new area of research, say, this is what I'm going to continue, and this is how I'm going to use my startup period. You should also flesh out what kind of collaborators you have possibly within the department or the institution at large. So people should walk away from this with a very three-dimensional picture of what you're going to do when you hit the ground. And then in terms of teaching, you should be able to address what you're going to teach within an academic department, if that's what this job you're interviewing for represents, a cell biology, cell molecular biology program, or a biomedical engineering program. What is it that you can teach for them? Right? If they're going to provide your salary, they want to know what it is you're going to do for your teaching mission. And if you have specific experience that you can share with them, you've TA'd, that's great. If you've been an adjunct and you've actually taught a course, you should highlight that. You should talk about your teaching, and if you've had good experience, highlight that, because even though everybody wants to know about your research and what grants you're going to bring in, very few people actually come to the table with a lot of teaching experience, and when you do have it, you should definitely highlight it. So when you go to that one-on-one interview and you're sitting and meeting with specific faculty during the course of the day, what's it like and who are you going to be talking with? Well, you're certainly going to be meeting the chair of the department or the director of the program, and quite possibly you're going to be meeting with the dean as well. You're certainly going to meet with senior faculty in your area. You should be meeting with young faculty as well. In my department, every visitor in every area meets with all the faculty, even if it's outside their area of interest. When you meet with young faculty, one of the things you should get a sense for is, were their startup commitments fulfilled, and are they happy? Because if they're disgruntled and that's a uniform pattern, that should tell you something. I'm also introducing the concept that when you're interviewing for a faculty position, they're interviewing you, but you're also interviewing them. You should ask to meet with, if they haven't identified for you faculty from other departments that are relevant to your research area, you should make sure that happens. And I, for one, really believe strongly that you should meet with a cohort of graduate students. And if you have specialized research needs, you're going to run a really big, you need to run a mouse breeding colony, for instance. If you have specialized research areas that require special support, you should try and make sure to meet with the facility manager in your interview process as well to make sure that they can accommodate your needs. If you breed 10,000 mice a year, that's a discussion you need to have with their facility manager before you go there. If they have not identified names of people with synergistic interests or collaborative potential for you outside of the immediate department, feel free in your either cover letter or in your emails with them to say, I'd like to meet with so-and-so in this department. They do some really interesting research which is peripherally related to what I do, but I think there's a synergistic potential. So feel free to ask to do that, and also it shows them that you've done your homework. And when you talk with individuals, what do you actually do on a one-on-one basis? Well, obviously do your homework. You'll prepare some topics and questions. And you don't need to know the list of everybody you're going to meet with because departments are not that big. You can go and research everybody's area and have a good idea what they do. But mostly, you're going to be talking with researchers. And there's only one thing that researchers like more than doing research, and that's talking about their research. And so when you ask people, we meet with people and say, could you tell me a little bit more about this? Listen to what they say and let them drive the conversation. So above all, listen to the interviewers and solicit input. That's going to be very instructive for them, and it's going to be very informative for you. And when you close out, when you leave, I would recommend that you send a little thank you letter or emails to the interviewers. Some people like to send in cards. I'm not a big one on format. I think emails do fine. I think that closing the loop and saying thanks for taking the time to meet with me is a good way to keep it's good manners, and it's a good way to keep the information fresh in their minds. I'm going to say a few things about etiquette, and I know some of this sounds obvious, but I've had people show up. I've had people violate these rules. So dress code. You show up in its business, so dress accordingly. And that means a sport jacket, shirt, and tie for the men, and business attire for the women who are listening in here. I know this sounds silly, but I have seen people show up to interviews in a windbreaker. All right, and I've actually had people when I was recruiting it for a couple of years ago show up in basically a pair of khakis and a windbreaker, and it looks kind of weird when the search committee is sitting there in a shirt and tie, and the candidate is showing up in street casual clothes. I've had the other as well. I had an interview once where in one of my early interviews where when I got to where I was interviewing, it was 110 degrees, and the entire audience was in shorts, but I was in a jacket and tie, but I did take my jacket off, and I was able to make a joke out of it and say, hey guys, you've seen the jacket, I own one, and that was that. But do dress accordingly. One of the things that happens in interviews is there's a lot of food involved, a lot of eating with interviewers. There's often lunches, and there will certainly be a dinner involved. And these informal interactions tell the people you're out to dinner with, the chairman, the search committee chair, much about who you are and how you will fit in with the department's personality, all right? And because departments certainly do have personalities. So be on your, be interactive, be honest, don't be, terribly uptight, because that doesn't come across very well, unless, of course, you're an uptight person. And one of the questions that my postdocs often ask me before is am I allowed to have a glass of wine? And the answer is, of course you're allowed to have a glass of wine or a drink if you can hold your alcohol well, but don't indulge too much. And also remember that this interview process, which is going on for a day or a day and a half and starts at 8 o'clock in the morning and you're sitting down to dinner at 7 o'clock at night, it's kind of like going to the ORS meeting. It's nonstop, right? You're going to be dehydrated and tired, and so even a little alcohol sometimes affects people the wrong way. So I mention that because it's something you ought to be cautious about, and because you don't want to do anything you're going to regret. So At the end of the interview, at the close of the interview, you're typically going to have a closeout talk with the department chair or the search committee chair. And, you know, it's perfectly appropriate, since you're interviewing them as well, to ask what the timing is for their decisions and what the next steps are in their search processes. And if it has not been covered by other people earlier in the day, make sure to ask about administrative department details about how things work in that department and institution. You know, can you have a secondary appointment if this is relevant? What are the expectations for junior faculty in terms of external funding, teaching, service, and how do they count towards promotion and tenure? You know, how will they be evaluated? If they have not been addressed, you should be asking about it. And the fact that you're asking about this, as a chairman, I take this as a good sign. It means that you actually know how the process works in general terms, and you want to understand what the work requirements, the administrative requirements are for the particular microenvironment that you're interviewing for. So it shows that you understand the process. And other thing is, you know, you may just, you know, you may have the magic interview and they may love you, and they'll, you know, you know, and the search committee has already been talking during the day and decided that you're the person they're going to want to negotiate with. So they may ask you in general terms by the end of the day what your startup requirements are. So you should be thinking before you interview what your startup is going to look like and what your lab is going to look like. So you should be able to outline it in fairly general terms. I need a wet lab, I need a dry lab, and you should be thinking about what your configuration is going to look like. And you should be prepared to send the detailed information along pretty quickly, along with a strategic plan. When you think about your startup, be realistic about what you need to succeed. You know, don't ask for the world. You know, don't over ask, but certainly don't under ask. Don't go cheap. All right, don't sell yourself short, because if you don't have what you need to do to succeed, you know, that's going to hurt you in terms of you're getting your grants, you're getting your promotion, and getting your tenure. So, and you shouldn't do this in isolation. Please ask for your mentor's help on this, your postdoc mentor. Ask other people you have relationships with. Make sure this is all vetted. And, you know, but, you know, don't ask for a confocal microscope just because you want one of your own, because most institutions are going to have them, as long as you can verify that it's a core facility and you have access. On the other hand, if it's a place where everybody owns his or her own instruments and nobody shares, well, first of all, that may not be a fun place for you to be as a junior faculty member, but certainly you should ask for what you need if you can't get access to other instruments. A few other things to talk about. You should ask about institutional internal research funding. Do they have policies? Or can you roll some research support into your startup cash allowance? How long is your startup going to last for? Is it going to be a 3-year startup package to spend the money? Is it going to be a 5-year startup package? Do they provide graduate student support for their, you know, for new faculty? If you're on a 9-month appointment, you know, do they provide summer salary for the first summer or the first 2 summers? What's the issue with lab space and renovation? Do they have lab space, and will they pay to renovate it? And are there relocation expenses? Because, you know, you're going to have to relocate yourself and possibly some research materials as well. So that's all part of what needs to go into your startup package, and make sure you cover that stuff. Last thing is a tip that I want to give you that I've learned over the years. When you present your startup, you're going to present a strategic plan for your research. What is he going to do? You're basically going to take what you presented in the chalk talk and put it into a research plan. This is what you're going to do first, and this is what you're going to do second. But when you present your startup request, I like to see it as part of a business plan. It's the business plan to support your strategic plan. So, and what I mean by that is you're going to want a program to make a very big investment in your success. So by the time you go do a startup, by the time they renovate lab space and equip a lab space and pay startup salary and grad student support and give you some discretionary funding that you can use for whatever it is you're going to want to use to get your pilot data, you know, institution's going to make $1 million or more investment in you. So it would be very helpful to them if you, before you say, just give me the money, you say, here is what you will get in return for your money, and I expect that by year 2, I will be able to bring in a foundation grant, typically around this size, or I'm going to go for an RO3 type grant, and for 3 years it's $60,000 a year, and this will come in with federal indirect costs. So you should give them an idea of what the revenue is going to look like as well, because that makes them understand that you understand the business process. They're making an investment, they want a return on their investment. Return on their investment isn't just that you're really smart and you publish good papers. There's a tangible return as well that the departments are looking for in terms of grants. And if you can express that right at the outset, it makes anybody on a search committee much more assured that you know what the ground rules are. So with that, what can you expect in an offer letter? Well, pretty much everything we just outlined. Title, salary, home department, expectations should be spelled out. Starting date, it's usually a bit negotiable within small areas because most places have programmatic needs. And the startup package details, are outlined should be very clearly outlined in your offer letter. Some institutions send an offer letter that says, here's what we're committing to in terms of faculty appointment, and and this is the startup we're committing to you. That's often public institutions that want to separate, startup from a public taxpayers line. So all of that should be in your cover, in your letters, and if it's not, and it has to be signed by everybody, and it should be articulated very clearly because this is your legal document. So with that, I'm going to wish you all the best of luck in your interviews and negotiation process. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop talking right now and hand this back to Dr. Liu, and I'll hope to be answering your questions a bit further on. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitch, for sharing your insight and expertise with us today. And again, if you have questions, please click on the questions box in the menu on the right side of your screen, and you can type your questions there. Our second speaker today is Dr. Eve Donnelly. Dr. Donnelly is an assistant professor and the Dale Corson Sequence Tenure Faculty Fellow in the Department of Material Science and Engineering at Cornell University. She received her bachelor and master degrees in material science and engineering from Stanford University and a PhD degree in mechanical engineering from Cornell University. Dr. Donnelly was awarded an NIH National Research Service Award for her postdoc training at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York City. She joined the faculty in materials science at Cornell in 2012. She has received the New Investigator Recognition Award from ORS in 2009, the Young Investigator Award from the SBMR in 2010, and the Junior Faculty Research Award from the ASBMR in 2012. Her research is mainly about identifying material factors that contribute to the integrity of healthy bone and to improve the prediction of structural failure and the treatment of diseased bone tissue. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Donnelly.
Thanks, Dr. Liu, and thanks to the ORS for inviting me, and thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. I'm hoping my slides are going to work. Oh, there we go. Okay, fantastic. So today I have just a brief talk, and then we'll take your questions. Today I'm going to focus first on your visit and your public seminar. I'll expand a little bit on what Dr. Schaffler said with some specifics on the Chalk Talk, and finally finish up with some strategies for negotiation. So first, the visit and public seminar. So just to reiterate a little bit about what and expand on what Dr. Schaffler said. So I interviewed at multiple Research One universities, and all of my interviews consisted of visits that were 2 days long. Your visit will usually consist of 2 talks. At most places it will be 1 seminar and 1 research vision talk, what is sometimes colloquially called a Chalk Talk. This is the norm for most Research One institutions. At some places, we'll ask you to give one seminar and one sample undergrad lecture. This is typical, Georgia Tech is famous for this. Also, some teaching-focused institutions will ask you to do this format. As Dr. Schaffler mentioned, breakfast, lunch, and dinner are all part of the interview. It's a grueling all-day process. So while breakfast, lunch, and dinner may feel informal, I would like to emphasize that you are very much being interviewed during these times. I will also mention that breakfast, lunch, and dinner can feel more informal to the interviewers, and this is the time when I should mention that I think candidates should be prepared to be asked questions that are technically illegal in the United States, but are still unfortunately sometimes asked, and not always with bad intentions. So definitely be prepared with your answers to questions like, are you married, do you have children, etc. These questions are technically illegal, although sometimes still asked. So be prepared with your responses to these. They are sometimes still asked. Your meetings are all day, each day. They're mostly one-on-one with faculty. You'll sometimes also meet with graduate students. I would strongly encourage you to ask for this if you don't see it on your schedule ahead of time. You'll definitely also meet with the department chair as well as sometimes the dean. So your open seminar talk, all of you in the audience have seen these. These are typically a 1-hour window of time. I would say to plan for 20 minutes of talk and 40 minutes of talk with 20 minutes of Q&A. Do not go long. There's no better way to alienate your audience than to go long on these seminars. As Dr. Schaffler said, the audience is going to be broad. But keep in mind the majority of the audience will not be experts in your field. It's going to consist for sure of the faculty from the department in which you are interviewing, interested faculty from other departments, as well as probably graduate students, as well as perhaps residents or fellows, depending on the institution where you're interviewing. So in the public seminar, the key here is that you must communicate effectively to non-experts while simultaneously including a few kind of gold nuggets of information to impress the experts. But don't go overboard trying to impress the experts and lose those non-experts, because the majority of your audience is going to be non-experts. So I would echo Dr. Schaffler's advice to make sure to practice your talk with people who are not from your lab and maybe even not from your department. So before you give a seminar, make sure to do this, or I recommend doing this self-evaluation. If you're presenting technology that you have developed, ask yourself, have you shown how it's better than the state of the art? If you're presenting science, ask yourself, is the information you have gathered new compared to what was known before? Do you compare your work to that in the literature, and are the improvements that you have shown clear and quantified with respect to the work in the literature? If you haven't done this, it's going to be difficult for non-experts to see how your work is better than the state of the art or new compared to what was known before. So this is going to be the key to making your work accessible to non-experts. Okay, so once you've done your open seminar, next is going to be the chalk talk. Okay, all of the chalk talks that I did were private seminars presented to the department faculty. They were typically a 1-hour-long window. I prepared slides for all of them, although it's possible that you might be asked to give this extemporaneously. In all the ones that I did, I was asked to prepare slides. My advice here is to prepare no more than 15 slides. and to prepare a talk that could be given in 15 minutes, but to expect Q&A to interrupt your talk many times and to fill out the hour. However, you should be prepared for it not to if there are not very many questions. The majority of the department faculty who are attending your talk may not be experts in your field, yet they usually have an equal vote on whether to make you a job offer. So here again, you need to communicate effectively to non-experts. If you're only reaching the experts, you're missing the majority of the faculty who are going to be voting on your candidacy. So what should you do to prepare? Okay, so one way to structure a chalk talk, and I think this is most effective for junior candidates. For you, the senior candidates out here, I think there's a lot more flexibility. But for junior candidates, I would suggest preparing 1 to 3 slides on the big picture. And here you should include a 1-sentence kind of nutshell description of who you are as a researcher. And then I would include 3 kind of mini proposals consisting of 2 to 3 slides each. The first proposal should be mature, thorough, very specific, kind of ready to submit tomorrow if you needed to. Proposal 2 should be the next kind of natural evolution, partially mapped out with partial preliminary data. You could submit it now, but it would be much better a year from now. Your third proposal should be an exciting direction that you want to go, mapped out but maybe not substantiated yet with preliminary data, best to submit 1 to 2 years from now. Each proposal should be specific. As Dr. Schaffler said, it should include a target agency or foundation. It should have specific aims and objectives with hypotheses. If it's hypothesis-driven research, it should also include preliminary data for those immediate proposals. Your second and third proposals must differentiate you either implicitly or even better explicitly from your mentors. During your chalk talk, note explicitly your proposed faculty collaborators at that institution and make sure that most are in the department you are interviewing with. This is going to show that you're a good fit for that department. You should also include 1 to 2 slides on teaching. This is for a Research 1 institution. Obviously, if you're interviewing with a teaching institution, you should include many more. Here on these slides, I would definitely recommend listing the specific classes you can teach by their name and number at that institution. And here, a little bit of homework on teaching goes a long way to impress the faculty at that institution. I can say that definitely the chalk talks were the most grueling parts of the interview. I got peppered with questions. The best way to prepare is, I think, to think ahead of time, prepare answers to as many tough questions as you can think of that the department might ask. So here are some questions that I would recommend preparing answers to. I got asked these questions almost everywhere. Key ones to think about. Who is your main competition going to be? How are you going to compete with them? In particular, how will you compete with your PhD advisor and postdoc mentor? Those are very obvious questions that you will absolutely need to know the answers to. Another tough one that I got asked is, if funding for your research area dries up, what are you going to do about it? What other research areas could you pursue? Kind of a philosophical one is, how will your group measure success? How will your peers measure your success? And another one to think about, especially for departments that are expanding quickly, is, if we hire you, what future hires down the road would complement you? There's a lot of other questions that you could be asked. Talk to your mentors. Talk to other people who are interviewing, who have interviewed last year. Ask them what questions they got asked. Compile a list and prepare answers. It's better to be prepared for the tough questions than to kind of stand there shell-shocked during the chalk talk. You can just deliver a smooth, prepared answer. Okay, the final point I want to talk about today is negotiation. This is tricky. There's a lot of specifics that we're happy to address in the Q&A. These are just some general points. Okay, you are at your strongest position when the department has decided that they want to make you an offer. So once the faculty finally agree on a candidate, the number one thing that the chair wants is your signature on that offer letter. So you're in a very strong position when the department decides they want to make you an offer. Conversely, you're at your weakest position the instant you sign that offer letter. The chair is going to think that the negotiation is done when you sign, so don't sign too early. Most applicants are kind of nervous to negotiate. Don't be afraid. One thing you can do to kind of reduce apprehension about negotiating is that you can reduce information asymmetry between you and the chair. So the chair knows all the faculty salaries and startups in his or her department, but you might not have very much information about what salary and startups you should be asking for. One thing you can do to reduce this information asymmetry is to figure out current assistant professor salaries and startups at comparable institutions. So you can ask your close colleagues that have recently been hired about the specifics of their offers. So that's kind of an obvious one. I think we all have kind of a limited number of close colleagues that we feel comfortable doing this with. But another way to get more information is that you can ask recent hires and chairs at comparable institution. You don't have to ask them specifics, but you can say what would be a typical salary and startup for a new assistant professor at your department. And they may not tell you exact numbers, but they might tell you a range, and that can give you a little more information to go by for what you should be trying to, what a typical amount should be for a salary and startup. Sorry, there's some construction going on in the background in the lab above my office. I'm sorry if that's background noise. Okay, so some strategies for negotiation. Negotiate honestly and forthrightly, but forcefully. So in general, you and the chair are a team. Your job is to make you successful, but when you're negotiating, you may temporarily be adversaries. But remember that if you eventually accept your offer, the chair is going to be your boss. So make sure to act in good faith. You don't want to have started off on the wrong foot with that chair. Keep in mind that you want to negotiate for salary or startup money, teaching relief, or a particular start date, not just because you can get it, but rather because if the department gives it to you, it will make you more successful, and therefore it will make the department more successful. I like Dr. Schaffler's idea of presenting it as part of a business plan of how it will make the department more successful. Also keep in mind that your competitors are getting startup money and lab space and teaching relief. You also need to get it comparable amounts, or the department is ultimately undermining your ability to succeed. So don't be afraid to ask for appropriate startup money and lab space and teaching relief to do the work that you propose to do. Present your list of requests as the resources required to enable your research success. Here I would recommend creating an itemized spreadsheet detailing all of the resources that you require. This includes lab space. Make a list of the facility and animal fees, major equipment, minor equipment, and supplies. Here make sure to look up real prices. I think many of us as grad students and postdocs are not aware of the real prices of lab equipment. Sometimes it will shock you. Make sure to if you need a particular piece of equipment, look up the real price so that you know how much everything is going to cost you to buy. This is going to help you ask for what you need without underestimating and selling yourself short. Secondly, if something is important, make sure to get it in writing so that the institution's commitments to you can be honored through changes in leadership of the chair or of the dean. Okay, we can mostly address multiple offers in the questions, but I have just a few kind of general principles. Obviously, obtaining competing offers from multiple institutions are going to put you in the strongest possible position to negotiate for lab space, salary, startup, etc. So having a competing offer puts you kind of, gives you kind of ultimate negotiating, it gives you more negotiating power, not ultimate, but strong negotiating power. Okay. So I have a caveat. I do agree with Dr. Schaffler that you should spread your interviews out so as not to exhaust yourself. However, the one countervailing factor I would say to that is that if you anticipate multiple offers, there is a time limit on those offers. You're not going to have them forever. So if you anticipate multiple offers, I would say I would recommend scheduling the offers from those schools relatively close together, not necessarily back to back, but maybe in consecutive weeks, so that if you do get those offers, you can consider the resulting offers in parallel and use them to negotiate for salary, startup, etc. You're typically going to have 2 weeks to respond to an offer, and it's usually not in the department's interest to give you much more time than that to respond, because the department needs to move on to their second choice candidate if you decline. So we can talk more about this in the Q&A if people are interested. So I would say don't pack your interviews back to back to back, but if they're very spread out and you get multiple offers, you may have to decline one before you've even had your final interview. So keep those two things in mind. And finally, I would say if you do decline an offer, make sure to decline them tactfully, and as soon as you decide you're going to decline it, decline that offer promptly. Remember that the academic world is small, and your future tenure letter writers may be the chairs whose offers you decline, so decline them graciously and tactfully. Okay, finally I'd like to address what I think are some key mistakes. One would be to accept an offer too early before you think you're done negotiating, so make sure you're done negotiating, then accept the offer. Next would be to trust in the good nature of the chair. The chair is not evil. They just can't control everything. They have many factors that they need to consider. So if you need something, make sure to get it in writing. Finally, or thirdly, one mistake is to fail to ask for important resources you want or need. If you need it, make sure to ask for it. Fourth is to fail to understand what the chair can and can't do and what his or her motivations are. And finally, I think maybe the worst mistake is to create an adversarial environment that creates a lot of mistrust. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Eve, for sharing your insight and expertise with us today. So now our two speakers are open to questions, and you can type your questions in the question box on the right side of your screen. And here we got our first question is what kind of age a candidate has if he or she is carrying a K9900 award. Mitch?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Yes, the question is what kind of age a candidate has if he or she is carrying a K99 award.
What kind of age?
Yeah, I guess the attendee is asking, whether there's any advantage if the candidate is carrying a K-99 award.
Well, I'm going to answer the question more generically. You are in the absolute strongest position to negotiate, interview and negotiate if you have funding, period, okay? And whether you're coming with a K-99R00 or you're coming in with an R03 or, or a foundation grant, if you have a track record of getting funding, you are in a very, very strong position right now because, funding is, that makes you a proven commodity. So it's not a matter of age, it's a matter of funding is a very, very high level bar for peer review and success. And if you've already succeeded in showing your funding potential, that makes anybody recruiting you much more comfortable that your program is going to be a good investment and that you're going to be able to succeed. Because I, as a chairman, want to recruit people who are going to succeed. That's really that simple. We don't run a pyramid in my department where we hire 6 faculty and tenure 2 of them. We hire 1 faculty, and we hope that 1 faculty is going to make it through the promotions process and succeed. So anything that a candidate can do to provide evidence that they're going to be successful in role as a faculty member is a tremendous, tremendous plus in the interview and negotiation process.
Okay, thank you, Mitch. And here's another question for you, actually. When is the best time to bring up a two-body issue?
When is the best time to bring up a two-body issue?
Uh-huh.
Well,
yes.
Well, first, Eve touched on the issue that there are questions that come up informally that are not part of the interview, but technically, if you're there for, they come up over meals. And so technically, if you're there for a whole day interview or a 2-day interview, they shouldn't be brought up at all. But how would you not bring up the fact that you have a family to move or a two-body issue, all right? So I, as a chairman, want to understand early on, by the end of that first day, the closeout and say, if there's a family move involved, that's fine. And honestly, in my experience, the issue of whether it's a two-body move or family relocation doesn't really factor into my thoughts very much on whether we're going to try and recruit somebody or not, unless the two-body problem is such that, and this is something we sometimes get in New York, is we have a faculty member and we have a spouse or a partner who is tied into, a venture capital firm or some major financial entity in, California, and it would be advantageous for them to be in New York, but it may not be portable. So if a two-body issue is, if it's a non-starter, then you probably should bring it up early on and probably not even be at the interview. But I would bring it up as early as possible when you're talking with the chair, usually when you're talking with the chair towards the end of the day.
Okay, thank you, Mitch.
Wait,
and,
Lucas, can I address that?
Mm-hmm, okay.
So I'm half of a dual career academic couple, and I think it's a really tricky, that's a tricky issue to address because I think the chairs want to know about it early so that they can take steps to make whatever arrangements are necessary. But I think during my interviews, I was nervous that if I brought it up early, I wouldn't get an offer, that my significant other was also in need of a faculty position, I wouldn't get an offer at all. And I think my main objective was to get one offer, and I was worried that I would get 0 offers if I brought it up early. So I think it's very tricky, and I actually waited until I got an offer to bring it up at some institutions where I was worried that I would not get an offer at all.
Yeah, I think Eve's point is well taken. I speak from the perspective of being in New York City, so often the earlier I know in the process, the more, excuse me, the more I might be able to help facilitate the process through contact, especially if it's a dual academic couple, because obviously we're all connected in the academic communities. If it's if it's a two-body problem, and the partner is involved, most significant others involved in the business community, it's nice to know about that, but there's not a whole lot I can do to facilitate that. On the other hand, in New York City, we have many educational institutions and research medical centers, and if you happen to be in biomedical research, sometimes knowing early can actually help the process. So I think it's context specific. I think we could agree on that, Eve?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. Actually, we have more questions here. The next question is, if there are more than one candidate being interviewed, and is there an order of preference in which they are typically invited to interview? Basically, the question is, would the top candidate be interviewed first or last?
No preference.
Okay.
It usually has to do with whose travel schedules allow, if it's an open search, then we interview people based on whose travel schedules can fit when, and when we can fit them into the seminar schedule. If it is a targeted search, where they already have the candidates in mind beforehand, that might go differently. But for an open search, all things being equal, our policy is there's no preference in doing that.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
Steve, your experience at Cornell?
Same here. It's all about travel schedules.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So actually, the next question is for Eve. And could you give an example of successfully or unsuccessfully negotiating for an item in your offer package? So such as salary, startup package, summer salary, graduate student support, any example?
Okay. I think what helped me the most was to have competing offers. So I can give two examples. So I had competing offers that I used to increase my startup package. And so I went back to one institution and they matched the offer from another institution. And then a third institution actually said, you know what, we can't match that offer. And I think that was okay too. Like, I've also told candidates, look, if you go to an institution and they can't match an offer, they'll just tell you that they can't match it and that it's their best offer. And the offer is still on the table if you want to take it. So nothing terrible happens. If you ask for more, they'll just tell you that they can't do it. There's nothing disastrous that happens with that. So I did successfully use a competing offer to negotiate for more startup. Mostly what I found, though, was that, for example, my offers were pretty standard in having offers for 2 years of summer salary, support for 2 graduate students for 2 years. Many of the offers were relatively similar in those respects.
Okay.
So I would add a comment to what Eve just said. Is, it turns out that the base elements of offers are not going to differ all that much for an assistant professor level recruitment in terms of summer salary support, for instance, and in terms the cost of starting up a laboratory. I mean, if you're starting up a wet lab or an experimental lab, they're pretty similar. So, we have a pretty good idea what theirs are going to cost, and the people you're negotiating with, if you have a reasonable chair in the department, they have a pretty good idea what things are going to cost. And so if you justify it well, there really isn't a problem where in terms of getting those things equalized among institutional offers. Where they diverge is, often in discretionary startup, discretionary funds that can be tied in research funding, and that is going to depend on whether you're going to a rich institution or a public institution, and there are a lot of things like that. And then, you may have offers, as Eve said, where somebody will say, that's a great offer you got from so-and-so. We can't match that. You're going to have to then decide whether you're going to go for the best offer on dollars, or you're going to decide where do you feel most comfortable. And, it's because it may not always be about the, who's giving you the most money, because in terms of what you need as an assistant professor, I think you're going to have to make that, each candidate's going to have to make that decision for him or herself.
Okay, yeah, great. Actually, Mitch has partially answered the next question. The next question is whether the expectation for tenure will be dependent on the amount or size of the startup package. So, Mitch,
well, I guess I'm going to answer that. I've seen people with reasonable startup packages that are not exorbitant or extraordinary in any way. They have good laboratories, and they're able to do what they need to do. And I've seen them go up for tenure, get grants, and be very successful. I've seen people go up with very exorbitant startup packages in institutions that have extremely deep pockets, and at 3 years, that they're going to hit the wall and they're not going to get tenured. So it isn't how much money you have; it's what you do with that money, right? And it is tempting as an assistant professor to think that if they gave you a huge 5-year startup package, you'll be able to do everything. But this has, and I think Eve can address this as well. Running your own program is really different than being a postdoc, no matter how much independence you're given, because you have to manage people, you have to manage resources, you have to prioritize things, you have to balance teaching commitments. And having a huge amount more money doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be more successful at it if you don't learn to be productive and effective with the resources you have.
Okay, thank you, Mitch. And our next question is how to prepare for a phone interview. I guess this is a time for a phone interview from a lot of schools. Eve, can you say something about that?
Sure. I mean, I would say they're going to ask, maybe prepare kind of like a mini version of your Chalk Talk in terms of, I guess I didn't have any phone interviews, so I don't know exactly what they're going to ask you, but I think they're going, I think they're primarily going to ask you to explain your, your research vision, and, what would what are your plans for the next, first 5 years, first 10 years? Those are kind of questions that I would anticipate having ready. Whom do you expect to collaborate with at our institution? I think you want to demonstrate that you would be a good fit for that department, that you've done your homework. Those are the kinds of things that I would prepare for in a phone interview. I don't know, Mitch, what do you ask?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it correctly. I think my experience with phone interviews right now, and at the level of junior faculty, is that they're not used extensively. They're often used if you have a cohort of candidates who we want to interview who are in Europe, and the time and expense and exhaustion level for the candidates of bringing over 4 people or 3 people from the EU to interview in New York or California is very complicated. So often they'll set up a 1 or 2 hour interview, and it's often like the Chalk Talk. Do you fit with, and it's a group interview sort of format, and how do you fit with the department's approaches? What is your research? What is your familiarity with American funding mechanisms? I mean, you can get a lot of that in. You'd ask different questions. We would, and when we've used that mechanism, we ask somewhat different questions of somebody whose training has been in Europe or Asia than we would in the United States, because they've grown up in a different funding model, and and we would often ask questions about saying, to try and get a sense of how well they're going to transition and whether they're prepared for the practical realities of running a research program in the U.S. or, for that matter, if I were moving to Europe, do I understand how to work the system in the EU? So those are the things we tend to do, and we try to use them only selectively where it can really improve efficiencies.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Due to a time issue, we have to stop here. So this webinar will be uploaded to our ORS website in the coming week. All of you will be notified via email when this recording is available. So on the website, you will also find some other information about resources and programming for new investigators, including the online Final and Tools resource and the events on grant funding, professional networking, and mentoring at the upcoming annual ORS meeting in Las Vegas. Lastly, upon exiting the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please do the evaluation and make any suggestions on how we can improve and moving forward. Your input is greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone in advance for completing the survey and for joining us today. And thank you to our speakers, Dr. Schaffler and Dr. Donnelly. See you all in Las Vegas. This concludes the ORS webinar, How to Find a Faculty Job, Part 2, Interview and Negotiation. Thank you.